If you've been playing video games for a long time, it seems increasingly common to feel that there is something noticeably wrong with the games industry in general these days. It feels as though it's becoming increasingly rare for a game to come out and shake up the world. And the only games to really do that are indie hits out of nowhere, or really huge games that everyone expected to be massive hits from these really big studios that don't have a choice but to release something amazing. And in those, I'm talking about the Naughty Dogs and the Rockstars of the world. But even then, those studios' games are becoming increasingly formulaic. Just look at the way all of PlayStation's big names are all very familiar feeling third-person action-adventure titles. Like, I can't complain too much because I like those games, but all these games looking for endless growth in the way that they must deliver these marginally improved visuals and growing ever larger in map size and story length. It's sometimes this is just to the game's detriment. The always bigger and better mentality isn't always bad, but it shouldn't be applied to every studio in the industry. Making literally everything bigger and better every time should really only stay contained to the studios that have the budget and workforce to sustain it. And even then, it has its negatives. And we're going to discuss these negatives and the ways we can tell this mentality has seeped into the entire gaming industry. To start though, we're going to talk about how we can tell games these days are a little worse than they were in the past. To be able to make the claim that games are worse in the modern day, we need to have ways to measure this change. Metrics or examples we can use to prove that there is a problem in the first place. Because knowing the effects of an unseen problem is usually the first step in diagnosing the source. And then with the source identified, we can accurately discuss the solution. So how are games worse today than compared to ones from the past? I think the easiest thing to notice is the ever-increasing reliance on day one patches and online updates. We receive so many games that are just completely busted upon launch. But after a few months, if the studio is really on top of things, the game could look completely different than day one. But it does seem that usually by that point, public opinion has already been mostly decided. Obviously, a great example of this would be Cyberpunk 2077. It's 3 years from launch, and I hear it's an amazing must-play game. A feeling I had during its lead-up to the game's launch. I had plans to get a hold of Cyberpunk around Christmas the year it came out. But then when launch day came in November, it had become the biggest joke in all of gaming. And I have yet to get around and try out Cyberpunk, and I doubt I'm alone in that experience. The cycle of having a bad launch and then course correcting later has plagued a ridiculous number of games in the last 10 years. Halo Infinite, Sea of Thieves, Fallout 77, Modern Warfare 3, No Man's Sky, Anthem, and the list goes on and on. Not knowing if a game you're excited for is even going to function properly at release is a huge deterrent of pre-ordering. It changes the way people consider buying their games. There isn't much good faith anymore surrounding the launch of a new video game. And sometimes getting that pre-order was the only way some customers were ever going to buy that game. What I mean is, there are probably a lot of people who are excited for an upcoming game, but rather than pre-ordering like they would have in the old days when it was always pretty certain that a big release was gonna be generally good, if not great, they hesitate and end up waiting to hear what everyone says about the game after it launches. Obviously, some of this can be ascribed to like the YouTube culture, YouTube review culture, but either way, this greatly increases the chances they end up going, I'll wait for a sale. And that turns into them never buying the game as other games come out and take their attention. The fact that we are so used to getting incomplete or broken games upon launch is a huge negative that has creeped into the industry in the last decade or so. Another metric for how games can be seen as worse now is the way the fun has been slowly sucked from parts of the industry. One of the most anti-fun things to enter the gaming industry in recent years are all of the microtransactions we see within games. This is also pretty tied to the concept of the free-to-play model of games, where the game itself is free to play for all players, but the game developer makes their money charging for certain aesthetic items within the game or battle passes that allow players to play the game in order to earn these rewards. For the most part, straight paying for cosmetics that players want isn't in itself a bad practice. Like, it's not too bad when it's transparent and you're buying for the specific thing you want, not them getting bundled together to inflate the price. It's not a terrible system. Players should only be expected to pay for what they want to get out of it when a system like this is implemented in a game. The great compromise of the entire industry has become the Battle Pass, where players pay a one-time per season fee, where once accessed, they unlock items as they play the game and progress through the levels of the Battle Pass. I personally don't like the way most games implement their battle pass system. Maybe it's mostly because they all look the same and that most of them are super cluttered with their UI. I felt Halo Infinite's system was pretty good. I like the way that by completing the battle pass, you earn enough of the in-game currency to buy the next one. So if you played the game enough, or were just patient in completing all of the tiers if it took you a while, you'd only have to buy the battle pass one time and then just chain the rest. So that's how it was. I feel like I remember hearing about how they changed this system. I'll have to look that up, and that was a pretty good compromise. Definitely a lot better than the loot box system that worked like a gambling system within these games that people already spent money to play. But I get the feeling that gamers are tired of needing to make monthly purchases to continue progressing and earning some of the cool stuff within their favorite games. Again, this is especially true when every game ends up using this same system. It's incredibly boring and repetitive to see it as often as we do. This really ends up cutting out the feeling that you're actually earning the items through playing the game. Constantly being reminded that you had to pay into the system first. And the more time I spend thinking about the ways in which gaming feels worse these days, the more I really do think it's mainly these two issues I've brought up. The lack of completeness or polish, and then the crappy monetization systems in games are really, I think, the biggest issues we see in the AAA gaming market. And these things matter, and definitely influence the overall perception of the gaming landscape. Because past these two other things, there are still a lot of ways in which gaming is still getting better by the year. Visuals are still always making their gradual increases forward, mostly in a positive way. There are some arguments that developers can focus too much on fidelity to the point to where it takes resources away from the rest of the game. But overall, graphics are improving. Same with the stories. There have always been dud stories and campaigns in gaming, or games that were made with the story placed completely second to the fun of the gameplay. But this trend has also stayed steady. If anything, the increased amount of games we've been getting in the modern day raised the bar for what the stories and everything else can provide. So moving forward, we'll keep the focus on these big issues I raised previously, because those are the issues truly plaguing the industry and making things feel worse. With the issue more clearly established, it becomes pretty easy to see where it comes from and what allows it to persist. You just have to follow the money. It's not like video games in and before the early 2000s didn't make large amounts of money, but this older generation of games didn't make hundreds of millions of dollars, nor did they take hundreds of $1 million to make. There's a clear increase just after this period in the way the corporate landscape took notice and took advantage of the money-making capability of this entertainment medium. The mega corporatization of the video game industry has created an environment where the only concern is how much money can be generated from a game. This is why when people complain about the way games release incomplete or that they're sick of all the battle passes, nothing changes because those products still generate lots of money. But generating money isn't always an indicator of good quality. Take the Madden NFL games, for example. They're the only legitimately licensed football game on the market. Their product has been ridiculed by fans for years now for repeated lack of innovation and gross monetization schemes. But because it makes money, nothing changes.
Because everyone already knows that this is a trash product that is recycled with the same old shit every year. People are fed up. Claim your Play Pro edition. What the fuck? I already bought the game. And now the first thing that you see when you press start is, you got the game? Well, you didn't get the game. You need to get the game.
Executives at EA see the situation, but then see the money that is made from it and just keep figuring out ways to lower production costs and raise the addictiveness of their microtransactions. If other franchises could get away with this version of game development, they would do it. So now that we know what these issues are and how they ultimately impact the customer, we can talk about how this affects people making the product and how it affects the art of creating a video game. Good video games cannot exist without talented artists and writers. Video games are art. And when art is co-opted by companies that have the sole drive to collect money from a customer, it seems as though nobody above the frontline employees view these creations as pieces of art. At least when the company and IP it gets big enough. This is why we see really cool things coming from much smaller studios, because they're the ones actually being creative. Their goal is to make a fun, interesting video game, and that's generally it. Within the AAA space, it's all about generating revenue and literally nothing else. And I think that there's this obsession within the early 2000s as this golden age of gaming, and this concept is the reason why I think that is. See, that generation had a decent balance between games being corporatized money presses, but then they still kept a certain amount of artistic integrity. This was an interesting period where the pressures of monetization and endless growth hadn't fully infested the industry. Yet it had become large enough and made enough money to reach a certain quality and scope that was consistently impressing gamers. But now the year is 2024, and that era of gaming is looked back on so fondly because in the years since, nearly the entire industry has been completely infected by this growth of corporatization. The console companies have turned into full-scale publishers and now have been gathering up and owning independent studios. And in turn, they become the executor of all creative decisions within those studios. We've reached a point where quite literally the creativity of the games industry has been monopolized. This is what's sucking the fun out of our video games. So the only thing left to talk about is how to fix this issue. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I don't have all the answers. I'm not a game developer or know all the intricacies of the industry. But what becomes pretty apparent when researching this topic and seeing what those who do work in the industry are saying, the employees, those who are actually working on and making the artwork we call video games, they need help. Like the basic first step in ensuring that games as a product can improve over time is stop laying workers off. When your product takes a ton of artistic talent in order to be successful and popular, then you need to ensure that the people working on it feel safe enough to be creative. Working in constant fear that they may lose their job the minute quarterly earnings contain bad news is not a great place to be creative. I'm very supportive of developers unionizing for protections against the increasingly uncertain gaming landscape. If companies are going to continue growing and merging like we've been seeing lately, then ensuring that the employees being shifted between these conglomerates are protected will only grow in importance. Creating a video game doesn't follow the same type of production as building a car. Employees aren't on a conveyor belt repeating the same task all day. They're not as easily replaceable. Games take so much creative energy, so much talent, and this is really a studio's biggest asset. It's employees. You can't have a massive IP without the people creative enough to make it in the first place. I mean, we've seen plenty of studios change personnel and then really struggle to keep a popular IP alive because it's not the IP alone that makes the money. And I don't think these large companies fully grasp this concept. Keeping talented personnel with proven track record of successful game launches should be the top priority of every game studio. This would be step one of any action plan to see better games in the future. It's protect the employees. Next would be to emphasize the creativity of the teams making these games. With protections in place for job security, the next task would be to change the measuring stick of what makes a good video game at a corporate level. As a general example, Grand Theft Auto 5 made a metric fuck ton of money every year since 2013 for a very specific reason. It's that what released in 2013 was a spectacular whole package of a video game. And not even just its size. There have been smaller video games that have been just as successful as a whole package. They just maybe didn't contain a multiplayer segment that lasted 10 years. But Grand Theft Auto 5 released very feature complete with its open world and story that was super expansive and very well made. I know that the online had to release a week later. I think that was forgivable due to the length of the narrative. And the online mode was also a very detailed sandbox that was incredibly fun to explore with friends. The content flow never let down and continued to provide players with new things to do and was always expanding in meaningful ways. Grand Theft Auto's money-making story began with the most important aspect first, a great game. Then the other modes were added and subsequently monetized, as it should be. Games these days are made backwards. Imagine getting Grand Theft Auto 5's online mode, and imagine if that empty Los Santos game mode dropped without the story. It would have been a very boring world that was obviously tailor-made for multiplayer monetization. Yeah, it being Grand Theft Auto, it maybe eventually would have picked up a player base regardless, but it surely wouldn't have been nearly as popular. But this is how games are designed from the inception these days. It leads to a bulk of modern releases being these empty, open world, multiplayer driven experiences that start off empty. And this puts clues everywhere that the sole intent was to serve as a form of monetization. all because the corporatization of the industry has removed the focus on creating an artistically great video game, then monetizing it second. It's put this focus solely on generating that profit and building that monetization scheme. And I know from a business standpoint, it comes across as kind of counterintuitive, but honestly, the way we fix modern gaming is to focus on making a great game first, and then profit second. And meaning it when you say you're trying to do that. Showing that commitment in every action and decision that comes from upper management. Because that's what's wrong with modern gaming. We get a lot of talk about how we want to improve the player experience or expand our stories, but then everywhere we look, it's all battle passes, monetization schemes, and broken games. When you say you want to make a great game, mean it, and focus on the employees in the game first. And if you want to see more from me, click on one of the videos on screen now. Thanks for watching.